Hey guys, Sheldoge here. Today we are looking at the Irok SI09 and the Madlions Zeus. While I did find some branded information as far as socials go on Madlions from much earlier, both Irok and Madlions did release their first product in late 2024, with Irok being more well known for their keyboards and Madlions for their mice and keyboards. Both of them creating their own budget Type 99 alternative, which we'll be looking at today and deciding which one would be worth buying, as these two are some of the cheapest pads you can buy currently. While Irok does admit that the SI09 is directly supposed to be similar to the Type 99, Madlions describes the Zeus as a balanced surface suitable for many types of games, which to me just doesn't stand to be true. I bought both of these pads from AliExpress from different sellers, which at the time of this video neither Madlions nor Irok has an official AliExpress store, so I will link the vendors that I purchased these pads from in the description. Now, starting off with the surfaces, looking at the Irok SI09, looking at a macro shot, the SI09 surface weave is somewhat similar to the Type 99 surface weave, with the main difference being that it actually goes in the opposite direction than the Type 99, with threads going downward rather than upward. In addition, there is a light amount of stray threads that are looser than others, and it is overall a fair amount tighter than the Type 99. The SI09 is similar to the Type 99 in that a lot of the control feel comes from skin contact with the pad, and has a lot of variability, becoming much more controlled when pressing down on the surface, which is magnified with its softer base that the SI09 uses. Comparing the SI09 directly to the Type 99, the SI09 does feel a bit more tactile than the Type 99, as the Type 99 has a leveled feeling to it, while the SI09 feels like the concavity and the texture is magnified compared to the Type 99 due to its increased tightness in the weave. When it comes to the skin to surface contact, I would say that not only the Type 99 feels smoother, but there is more variability, as I feel I can lightly glide across the surface of the Type 99 without any sticky feeling, but with the SI09, the high start and stop power is always active. Moving on to the surface properties of the SI09, the SI09 has a fairly low static friction compared to its dynamic friction, as when it comes to skate to surface contact, the surface feels very snappy, with tracking movements feeling purposeful. As expected though, most of the static friction will come from skin to surface contact, so in practical use, the SI09 feels much more controlled and very snappy with the higher feeling static frictional value. Though this feels artificial, and I do try to avoid surfaces that initiate their static friction from skin to surface contact, as it can create inconsistencies. The SI09 does have a good amount of stopping power with its surface weave properties, and especially with the softer base paired with it, you can really stop your flicks on a dime. But with the skin to surface static friction, you have to be controlled with how much you press your hand into the surface, as to not activate the stopping power early or late into a movement. There isn't too much of a difference in terms of texture between the X and Y axis, but there is a very noticeable difference in terms of frictional values, as the X axis feels a lot slower than the Y axis, and especially when considering skin to surface contact, this is only magnified, as the Y axis feels much quicker than the X axis, making this surface really meant for aiming across one axis for games like CS or Valorant. The SI09 doesn't handle sweat too well, as it takes a while for moisture to disperse when absorbed into the surface, but I certainly don't have nearly as much concern for the humidity resistance, as the open gaps of the surface weave make for a less ideal environment for moisture to get trapped. I would say the SI09 is sleeve usable, as it works well enough for use with the TBTL or Kibu Irreversible sleeves, but none of the sleeves that I have works excellent with the surface of the SI09, with the best I have being the TBTL, but it still drags a little bit on the X-axis. The SI09 can feel a bit hard to keep clean, as debris does feel like it can get caught in the surface weave, especially with fuzzy bits, as the soft texture makes it easy for hair and fuzzballs to get stuck within it. And here's an audio test with Magic Ice Dot Skates on my G Pro X Superlight to show what this texture can sound like. Now, moving on to the surface of the Madlions Zeus, looking at a macro shot, the surface of the Madlions Zeus is much more loose and has much more fluff or thickness to the weave than the SI09, with less empty space between each row of threads on the surface, which I believe makes for an overall smoother feel. In addition, it does look a tiny bit more loose and has a couple more stray threads that are looser than others compared to the SI09. Unlike the SI09, I do feel the Zeus has a much more smooth feeling to it, as it is much more similar to the Type 99 in the regard that it feels easy to lightly glide across, but you can still press into the surface to activate those high control properties of the Type 99 surface. It does feel a bit less soft in the way that artificial threads don't quite feel as soft as real cloth, but it isn't all that irritating. Comparing once again to the Artisan Type 99, unlike the SI09, the Zeus does almost come much closer to the genuine Type 99 surface feel. As comparing the two to each other, there isn't any obvious difference in terms of texture difference or sticky feeling skin to surface contact, as I feel I can still accurately glide across the surface on both of them. Unlike the SI09 though, the Zeus does feel like it has a bit less variability, as I do have to press down with a decent amount of force before I get that higher stopping power and frictional values, but I'd much rather have this than a surface that feels far too sticky in an impractical manner, as I feel that this can be a much better introduction to the Type 99 and other control surfaces than the SI09. Moving on to the surface properties of the Zeus, I would say the frictional properties of the Zeus feel fairly balanced with one another, and although it's certainly still a control surface, contrary to how Madlions describes it, it still has a very easy feel to it. It does stay fairly balanced when pressing down when it comes to skate to surface contact, but the skin to surface contact increases the control by a large margin, but still not ever to the point of being unusable. The stopping power on the Zeus surface feels very nice, while still not ever feeling overdone, as I do feel I can control how much I press into the surface, even despite still having a softer base similar to the SI09. There isn't too much of a difference texture-wise in between the X and Y axis, but also similar to the SI09 and Type 99, there is a pretty noticeable difference in terms of speed between the axes, as the X-axis feels a good amount slower than the Y-axis. The sweat resistance on the surface of the Madlions Zeus is fair enough, but I do feel it's far from good, as it does start to feel a bit muddier similar to the SI09 when I begin to sweat more, and similarly I don't feel the humidity resistance is the strongest on this surface for the same reason. The Zeus is just a notch below the sleeve friendliness of the SI09, as I would still call it sleeve usable, as it works with the TBTL and Kibu sleeves that I mentioned earlier well enough, but on the other hand, for the sleeves that it doesn't work with, it can be potentially damaging to the sleeves, as I do feel scratching on some when dragging along the surface. The surface of the Zeus does feel a bit easier to keep clean than the SI09, which might come from the inherently smoother feel due to its tighter gaps between threads in the weave, as debris brushes off easily enough, and I haven't found any hairs caught in the surface either. And here's an audio test with Magic Ice dot skates to show what this texture can sound like. Moving on to the base, both of the bases on the SI09 and Zeus consist of rubber and are described as X soft, and while they are certainly approaching that mark, to me the SI09 falls somewhere in the soft category, with the Zeus falling a notch below that, somewhere between soft and X soft. Both bases seem to have some level of adherence, maybe featuring some sort of sticky coating, but I do feel the Madlions Zeus is a fair level more adherent than the SI09, as I don't feel bothered by the lack of adherence that comes from rubber bases with it nearly as much as I do with the SI09. The Zeus measures in at 4.7 millimeters thick when measuring the entire thickness of the pad, with the SI09 being a bit thicker than that at 5.1 millimeters thick, but you won't feel too much of a difference during use between either of these pads in that regard. I would say the level of plushness the Madlions Zeus features falls somewhere near the level of plushness of that of the LGG Soft Style series bases, while the Irok SI09 is a level above that in terms of firmness, being somewhat closer to X-Ray Pad's newer rubber bases. As I stated earlier, both of these bases featured on these pads have some level of adherence, with the Zeus being slightly better than the SI09. And with both of them being rubber bases, I don't have any immediate concerns for the adherence wearing out over time, but as always, I will vouch for polyurethane over rubber any day, since the water trick doesn't work as effectively with rubber, along with other variables. The elasticity varies between the Zeus and the SI09, with the differences in plushness I mentioned earlier, but they do seem to spread force pushed into the surface fairly similar, and they have the same level of rebound strength and speed coming back up. All of these variables combined, I do not have too too much concern for dot skate compatibility on either of these surfaces. Moving on to stitching, the stitching pattern that both the Madlions Zeus and the Irok SI09 follow remind me closest of X-Ray Pad's newer stitching style that you can find on the Heavy B series, wrapping over the top and edges with dots of threads being visible from the bottom side of the base. The stitching does feel more separate on the SI09 as it feels much more compressed than the Zeus, with the Zeus seeming to be much less constricting, and I do feel that the underside around the stitching is able to grab onto the surface for some extra adherence. I would say the SI09 has a leg up over the Zeus when it comes to the firmness of its stitching, as while the Zeus edge stitching settles somewhere around the surface when pressing down from the top, the SI09 comes much closer to evening out nicely with the rest of the surface. On the other hand, the Zeus gets another leg up on the SI09 in terms of how below the surface stitching, as the SI09 even has some warping around the edges, which signifies to me that the stitching may have been done too tight as I suggested, but also the Zeus's stitching is much more below the surface than the SI09, so you won't feel your mouse cross over its edge with dot or full skates, but I can't promise the same for the SI09. Moving on to quality, as for the surface, neither of the surfaces are coated or feel any different to when I first used them. Neither the SI09 nor the Zeus have any muddy spots or any areas where the speed or control of the surfaces change. Neither surface features any art, so I don't have anything to say about the printing quality, but the heat treatment process on either pad doesn't seem to be too strong to the point where it negatively impacts the surface feel. I would say there is a bit of discretion with both pads, as the Zeus is much more of a controlled surface than a bounced surface as they suggest, and the SI09's base feels much less of an X soft base and more of a soft or even soft to mid base depending on who you ask. There is a logo on the bottom right corner of each of the surfaces, and to be honest, they feel pretty similar in that regard, as each one's logo is not thick or sticky enough to cause any issues during play, and neither of them are big enough to contribute to any issues either. Both the Zeus and the SI09 have pretty good surface alignment, with neither one being stronger in that quality in regards to the other. Moving on to quality of the bases, while the SI09 feels pretty close to perfectly flat all along the surface, I feel like the Zeus does have some minor bumps when gliding across, but not to the point where your average Joe would feel them, and this never created an issue during play where I'd feel or be bothered by them. The dimensions of each pad do indeed match the 490 by 420 millimeters described for each one. I couldn't find any discrepancies in base plushness along the surface, and neither pad feels any more firm or plush when getting closer to the edges. Neither of these pads seem to have super great quality in terms of stitching consistency, as distance between stitch to stitch and distance from the edge of the surface can vary with both, but these aren't any issues that will impact performance too much, and it makes sense with how cheap these pads are. The implementation for where the stitching meets on both surfaces are about as clean as you'd expect, or more necessarily as dirty, as there is a good amount of fuzz peeking out, and both feel much more firm approaching the overlap. Neither pad has frayed at all where I placed my arm, though the edge stitching of these pads do feel different in the regard that I'd have more concern for fuzz coming up with the stitching over long periods of use, but neither one really performed better in that regard over the other when scratching at the edges. Moving on to customer experience, while Irok and Madlions aren't super well known for customer service, I would say Madlions is a bit more transparent as they feature their own support ticket service, while Irok just gives you an email to copy when you click on their support tab, meaning you'd have to have an email if you were to contact Irok. This can create some issues depending on where you're located or other variables, such as if you have an email in the first place. On the other hand, Irok has a much more active social media presence, as you can easily find them posting on their Twitter, TikTok, and even YouTube accounts, the latter of which surprising me as you don't see that one too often from smaller brands. Neither brand seems to have a Discord server from what I could find, so that would certainly be a nice thing for both brands to offer in the future. I didn't buy either of these pads from their respective websites as it quite literally just wasn't an option for me where I was located, but I didn't have any issues with the AliExpress vendors that I purchased from, of which I'll be linking in the description if you're interested in either of these surfaces. Moving on to price, the Madlions Zeus came out to just around $13 including shipping, and the SI09 being somewhere around $14 including shipping when I bought both of them. Though it is worth noting that I used discounts for these totals, and additionally the SI09 may cost more as of now, as it seems the vendor that I bought from increased the price of it, so I'd expect somewhere around $20 if you use coupons. Both were packaged rolled up in a cardboard box with no branding, but Irok's does seem to show some flat packaging in some product images. I'm not sure where you'd buy one to get this flat packaging shown though. Neither pad came with any accessories, and it's hard to call either of these pads a waste of money with how cheap they are, but if there's one thing to take away from this video, it would be that these pads are practically the same concept, with the Zeus just having slightly better execution, making it the bigger deal in terms of cost. In conclusion, I would recommend either the Zeus or the SI09 to someone who wants an introduction to the Type 99 or other control surfaces before they spend the premium budget on one, though I would certainly recommend the Zeus between the two. I would rate the Irok SI09 a 79 out of 100 and the Madlions Zeus an 84 out of 100. I would certainly buy from Madlions again, as I do in fact enjoy their Mad G series quite regularly, but I do hope to see some more options from Irok, as they did come out with their own mouse recently. But besides that, I haven't experienced any other Irok's products and haven't heard much opinion of Irok as a brand in general. With that being said, thanks for watching. Bye bye.